So this is part 2 of the Columbia County Butterfly Talk. Dylan gave you the first part, and now I'll give you the second part. What I'm going to do is talk a little bit about the diversity of butterflies that we see in our county, and then a little bit about the habitats in which they occur. I've put up here our butterfly webpage. If you want to get more information about butterflies in the county, it includes our species list for our county, more information on the Columbia County Butterfly Atlas. And there's an email address if you want to write us about butterflies you've seen or questions that you have. So perhaps one of the most familiar groups of butterflies in the county are the swallowtails, the eastern tiger swallowtail, that large, elegant yellow butterfly. We also have the Canadian swallowtail, which is very similar to the eastern tiger swallowtail, but is a smaller, earlier flying species. We have the black swallowtail, we have the spicebush swallowtail, and a couple of other species that aren't shown here. And we've got a whole flurry of skippers. These little guys are the ones that Dylan mentioned. They're kind of moth-like, although you see they all have those knobs on their antenna, but they have thick bodies. They're relatively drab colored. They tend to be rather small. They fly very fast. In some ways, they're not a very charismatic group, but they're a very interesting group in all the intricacies of their life histories. We have the whites and the sulfurs. They tend to have a white wash or yellow wash and then some usually black markings on them. These include some of our most common butterflies like the introduced cabbage white and the cloud-headed orange sulfurs, which are not introduced, but they are quite common. And we have this group, Lacanidae, which includes the azures, hairstreaks, and coppers. Probably, if you had to make me pick a group, this might be one of my favorites. Just there's a range of patterns in here and a range of interesting ways that they make a living. And you see in there, in the lower left center there, you see that juniper hairstreak that Dylan mentioned, one of our, basically our only green butterflies. And then we have this big group, the Nymphalidae, which include quite a few familiar butterflies, such as the fritillaries. And in this image, you see the great spangled fritillary and then some of our other fritillaries, the Aphrodite, the Atlantis. And then there's a regal fritillary in there, the one with the dark black hind wings. We'll get to that. There's actually a snout in there. And then you have in that same group, you've got the checker spots and crescents, some of our most common butterflies. And I think down there in the bottom, you've got a meadow fritillary, the small fritillaries. You've got commas and question marks, the so-called angle wings, because their wings are essentially look like the tattered leaf edges. And if you're wondering why they're called commas and commas and question marks, it's because the white, little tiny white symbol or pattern on the underside of the wing reminds some people of punctuation marks. And so you've got a little crescent with a dot, and that's a question mark. And then the other ones that just have the crescent are called commas. We have a few different species of comma in the county. And you have also in the Nymphalidae, you've got the well-known monarch, and above that you see the viceroy, its look-alike. And then surrounding that are some more subtly colored butterflies. These are butterflies that tend to fly in forests or in sort of shady areas in and out of between bushes, like the common wood nymph. And here's another group of the Nymphalidae, kind of a hodgepodge, but it includes the ladies, includes the mourning cloak, the admirals, the tortoise shells. And I just wanted to point out that all of these images are from Samuel Scudder's Butterflies of Eastern United States and Canada, his masterwork published in 1889. Samuel Scudder studied butterflies, and so he was called a lepidopterist, in Boston in the late 1800s. And I think really he was one of a group of butterflyologists, of lepidopterists, who learned probably the majority of what we have so far learned about our butterflies. And his book is just an amazing compilation of observations from around the Northeast. So talking a little bit now about the butterflies that you find in different sorts of habitats. Let's go to old fields, and in old fields, you might find something like a tiger swallowtail. Now, this is a good place to point out that tiger swallowtails do not pass their whole life cycle in old fields. In fact, they will lay their eggs on woody plants, but yet the adults will come into these old fields in order to nectar. You get something like the clouded sulfur, which indeed may spend its whole life in a field like this, can be quite common. You get the introduced cabbage white, which I've already mentioned. Its caterpillars feed on various plants in the mustard family, and it also may spend its whole life cycle in this field. And you get something like the common ringlet, a kind of cute, fuzzy little butterfly, which brings us to our first butterfly mystery. And that is, why has this butterfly expanded south over the last few decades? So really, I think starting in the late 1900s, it started to come south. It was known mainly as a really more northerly butterfly, and yet now it is one of our more common butterflies. In a field like this, you'll probably also see a great spangled fritillary nectaring. Again, they're probably an example of a butterfly that doesn't necessarily spend its whole life in this field. Their caterpillars feed on violets, which are probably most likely around the forest edges, and yet you'll often see them in fields like this nectaring. A big showy butterfly. We also get meadow fritillaries in a field like this, and this is another butterfly with a mystery. And that is, if you go to iNaturalist and you look at recent observations of the meadow fritillary, what you'll see is that they're basically now absent from the eastern half of Massachusetts. And why is that? If you look at Samuel Scudder's data, his maps, you'll see that they were really throughout the state of Massachusetts, and now they're largely or effectively unknown from the eastern part of the state. I think the same also holds around New York City, where they used to be much more common than they are now. Now, violets still exist in those regions. What is it that has changed that has made this meadow fritillary, this species, so uncommon in those areas? Here's the pearl crescent, sometimes one of our most common butterflies. Its caterpillars feed on asters. Here's the monarch, a butterfly who will spend a good portion of its life, perhaps, or one generation will spend its entire life, perhaps, around a field like this. But then the butterflies that hatch out in the autumn will migrate south, and it will not spend, as a species, it will not spend the whole year here. Eastern-tailed blue, whose caterpillars feed on various members of the pea family, is also found in fields like this. It's a little piece of blue confetti. Silver-spotted skipper is our most conspicuous skipper, really. It's a big butterfly. It arrives with a bit of a flash, and it is often found nectaring on flowers in a field such as this. On the other side, the other end of the spectrum of being conspicuous, you get something like the dun skipper, a much smaller butterfly, less dramatically colored. This is a good butterfly on which to point out that you sometimes have sexual dimorphism in butterflies, and that means that the males and females are patterned differently. This is a male, and you can tell that because if you look at its right wing there's that black line going through it, and that's what's called the stigma. And it's a spot on the wing that secretes pheromones, probably involved in the mating ritual of the species, but females do not have those, and so you can tell the species apart. There's often also some variation in color. The dun skipper is said to be one of the three witches because it gives lepidopterists a headache, as three witches would. And it's hard to identify butterfly, and it looks very similar to two other skippers, the little glassy wing and the northern broken dash, which may also occur in a field such as this. Also in this field, we would find Peck's skippers, one of our most common skippers. It has this tan keyhole pattern on its underwing. That's a mating pair there. A mystery around these is, despite being one of our most common skippers, we are really not completely sure how its generations work. They probably have two generations most of the time, but it seems like sometimes some of the first generation don't actually, the eggs of the first generation don't actually hatch out that summer, but in fact go into a pupal diapause and overwinter. Now, what usually happens is they overwinter the second generation that comes out late in the summer. Those eggs develop into caterpillars, and those overwinter. But there's some confusion about the exact timing of these various life stages, even in this, one of our most common skippers. The tawny edge is another skipper you're likely to find in a field such as this. Now, for one reason or another, some of our old fields are extra special. So this happens to be the old field up at Steepletop in Austerlitz. And indeed, you would get probably most, if not all, of the butterflies you would expect that I've already mentioned. But then what's interesting is you start to get some additional characters. And this is the Aphrodite fritillary, a rarer cousin of the great spangled fritillary. The place where we know it most consistently is from Steepletop. We found it a few other places, but not as commonly. This is a good place to point out. If you look at the title up there, the name of the butterfly, you'll see it's orange on black, and that means this is a butterfly that we have only rarely seen in the county. It is also a butterfly with a mystery, and that is, it appears to have been much more common in the 19th century, and perhaps even more common than the great spangled fritillary, and yet today it is much less common than the great spangled fritillary. And what is it? What is it that makes this fritillary perhaps more susceptible to whatever the stresses are than the great spangled fritillary? This is the gray comma, another unusual butterfly that we know from only a few places. We have seen it around Steepletop, and there you can see its gray comma, which looks a bit more like a check mark or maybe the symbol of some sporting sneaker. But the gray comma is an interesting butterfly because it feeds on ryeberries or gooseberries, currants, and it was apparently also much more common in the 1900s. And then in the early 20th century, when New York State was planting conifers on former farmland as a way of trying to convert those abandoned lands to more productive purposes, it was noted that an important disease of white pine has as a secondary host the wild currants. And so there was a great push to actually eradicate currants, gooseberries, from our forests. And this butterfly seems to have suffered due to that. It's now quite rare. This butterfly, the coral hairstreak, is one that Dylan mentioned, and we have actually only ever seen it in the county up at Steepletop. Now here's a butterfly. You'll see now that this is yellow on red, and that means we have never actually seen this butterfly in the county, but it's one that, based on its distribution and its requirements, could be in the county, and it's the green comma, and maybe this would be a place to look for it. Now this is a butterfly display that I'm not quite sure where it was made. I bought it on eBay, so I don't know the exact date or location where it came from. I would guess it may well be the East Coast someplace, and perhaps sometime in the early 1900s, but that's just a guess. But you'll see many of the familiar butterflies on here: the tiger swallowtail, the black swallowtail, meadow fritillary, sulphurs, red admiral. But then there's a couple of butterflies in there that are perhaps not familiar to you. And you may have noticed these in the earlier slides that I showed you when I was talking about butterfly diversity. This is the regal fritillary. This is a butterfly that was widely distributed in the East Coast up until the late 1900s, and then it has essentially disappeared. I think there's one or two known populations in the East. There's a little bit more activity, a little bit more abundant populations in the Midwest, but it has essentially disappeared from the East Coast, and it's not clear why. So that's its mystery. Why is it gone from the East Coast? There are some theories. I wanted to show you lawn, not because it holds a great diversity of butterflies, but rather the reverse, because it holds so few or can support so few butterflies. Species, that is. You'll probably get something like the cabbage white and a sulphur, the occasional eastern-tailed blue. But it's pretty rare that you'll find anything much more extravagant than that. And I just wanted to point out that really lawn is not a great habitat for butterflies. It's not a great habitat for a lot of other species either. Here are gardens. That's a very flowery script, but that's what it says, gardens. And I just wanted to put this in here to remind you to, look out and look at the ornamentals that you have around your house, and occasionally you'll find something almost as exotic as those ornamentals themselves. And this is a butterfly pipevine swallowtail, which Margaret Roach observed in her garden. And it is a butterfly that feeds on a plant that doesn't usually grow in this region, but she had a suitable plant in her garden, and she is the source of the only known county record for this species. I wanted to talk about dry meadows, and I wanted to talk about dry meadows because they hold, again, another unique set of butterflies. Dry meadows are perhaps most typified by little bluestem, which is a native grass. It's a prairie grass, but it comes east. You might be most familiar with it as a grass of the rock outcrops along the Taconic State Parkway, but it occurs in some of our former sheep pastures and other dry open fields. This is a late summer shot of this field, and that kind of rusty brown that you see there in between the goldenrods and in between the bushes, most of that is little bluestem. And what's interesting is little bluestem supports a variety of butterfly species. And this is an Indian skipper. It's a butterfly that flies in the early spring and is closely associated with little bluestem. This is the cobweb skipper, likewise associated with little bluestem, flies often with the Indian skipper. And this is the Leonard skipper, which is associated with little bluestem, flies on the other end of the season, that is in late August, early September. Quite a handsome chestnut brown with white conspicuous markings on its underwing. And the mystery around it's not completely clear that it is tied with little bluestem because it's the only caterpillar food for it. Its caterpillars may indeed eat other grasses as well, but there's some connection between these two, and whether it's simply the caterpillar food tie or whether there's something else that little bluestem needs and that the Leonard skipper needs, and so they tend to co-occur. We don't really know. We don't know enough about the natural history of this butterfly, as with so many of our other butterflies. And finally, here's a butterfly that would be likely in fields such as this. We have never seen it. It's another one of the spring-flying skippers of dry meadows, and it is the dusted skipper. I also wanted to talk about wet meadows. This is a wet meadow that has Joe Pyeweed and boneset in it. Here's another wet meadow, another form of wet meadow. This one has lots of sedges. There's some iris in there. Places like this, you might find viceroy. Now, viceroy is perhaps not strictly speaking a wet meadow species, but it lays its eggs on willows, and you'll tend to find it around wet areas. This is a mating pair. You get things like the Appalachian or eyed browns, tend to be they are sedge feeders, and they tend to really only be found around sedgy wet meadows. Baltimore checker spot. Its caterpillars usually feed on turtlehead, which is a wetland plant. There's a mystery here because it's also now known that the caterpillars of Baltimore checker spot can survive on common plantain, or at least it's thought that some generations of them can. In other words, not generations, some stages of the caterpillar can, perhaps not all stages of the caterpillar. But why is it that really the Baltimore checker spot is nowhere near as common plantain, which is a widespread weed? Is it really that the caterpillars cannot fulfill their development on common plantain, or is there something else that is limiting the survival of Baltimore checker spot? Don't know. Mulberry wing, a little skipper, nice to see in wet meadows. It's a sedge feeder. Its caterpillars are sedge feeders, and it is closely tied to wet meadows, although I've occasionally seen them in flower gardens near wet meadows. bronze copper, nice little butterfly, one that I really am attracted to. It's got these sort of Halloween colors, and then in that hind wing, although it's hard to see here, there's an iridescent blue. And one of the mysteries around it, and I would say that this holds for quite a few of our butterflies, or at least several of our butterflies, is the question of how spotty can their populations become before they essentially disappear. So, for example, when you had beaver throughout the county, you probably had quite a network of wet meadows flashing on and off in the landscape slowly. And you probably could connect those quite easily if you were a butterfly. In other words, when one wet meadow got to be so full of trees it was no longer a wet meadow, a dispersing bronze copper could probably easily find another wet meadow at a nearby beaver meadow or beaver around a nearby beaver pond. But now such wet meadows are much more scattered throughout the county, and so you get these little pockets of bronze coppers. And the question is, what happens if the bronze copper population around this wet meadow, for example, went extinct? Is there any chance that a dispersing bronze copper from elsewhere would ever find this and repopulate it? At some point, the distances between the patches just get to be too big and the species crashes. Here's a bad photograph I can take full credit for. This is a picture of a silver-bordered fritillary, which I took in northern Dutchess County. It's a wet meadow species. We have never seen it in Columbia County, but the fact that it occurs in northern Dutchess County certainly suggests that it could be here. Here's a two-spotted skipper. I've never seen it either. Could be here. I'd like to talk about forests and the butterflies of forests. This is a red-spotted purple, quite a handsome butterfly. You may occasionally see it out in old fields, but it lays its eggs on woody plants. And there's a mystery around this. The red-spotted purple really comes in two forms, or this species comes in two forms, one of which is called the red-spotted purple, the other one of which is called the white admiral. They're thought to perhaps be two subspecies. And the white admiral is a more northerly form of this butterfly. The red-spotted purple is a more southerly form. In the county, they overlap. You get some that are apparently hybrids of these two forms. And indeed, in the county, the white admiral is more common in the northern parts than in the southern parts. Mourning cloak, a hibernating butterfly, one that you can see out flying about forests really almost at any time of year. If it's out in early spring before much is flowering, then it will probably get its nutrients from tree sap or from animal dung. Banded hair streak, I wanted to put that in here sort of as a stand-in for many of our hair streaks. It is a butterfly whose caterpillars feed on woody plants again, and it tends to be found in forests. And one interesting thing to note there is the symmetry. Notice how the tail on its wings looks a bit like the antennae. Those spots on its wings look a bit like the eyes. And indeed, we have found butterflies who apparently have been attacked by birds, and they have a triangle taken out of their wings. Presumably, a good part of the time, the birds get it right, and the butterfly gets it wrong. Here is the spring azure. It's a butterfly you'll see out in the woods now. It's a little blue speck of a butterfly. And one of the questions around it is really, how many species, darn it all, of azures are there? And different people have different ideas. Basically, you can't tell them apart on the wing. You may be able to tell them apart genetically or doing dissections. But in the end, we just call them all spring/summer azures and recognize that we're overgeneralizing. This is an interesting forest butterfly, the West Virginia white. This photograph was actually taken just a few days ago up in New Lebanon. This butterfly is on, the one you see here, is on two-leaved toothwort, and that is its native host. It will lay its eggs on this. The caterpillars can develop on it. We only know this butterfly from forests that have toothwort. But there's a bit of a mystery here, and that is back in the late 1800s, at least the second half of the 1800s, Our native whites, and at that time the West Virginia and muster white were lumped together in a single species, were flirting with pest status. So the state entomologist was warning people that, pretty soon you're going to have to control these butterflies. And then suddenly their populations dropped away. Now, why was that? At really about the same time that they started dropping, the cabbage white, European butterfly, was introduced accidentally into the Northeast. Was it perhaps competition with that butterfly that caused these butterflies to decline? Was it perhaps that garlic mustard started to spread and created an ecological trap for this species? Now you see in that picture up there, the white, West Virginia white, is on garlic mustard. And West Virginia whites and our mustard white, the other native white, which we could find, we have not seen it in the county, but it does occur in the Northeast. They will be tempted to lay their eggs on garlic mustard, but unfortunately their caterpillars cannot survive on garlic mustard. So they might actually feel rather frustrated, and their populations may decline as a result of the lack of caterpillar survival. This is the Harris's checker spot. We have never seen it in the county, but we have seen it across the river in Greene County. It occurs in forests with flat-topped aster. Could be here, worth looking for. This is the early hair streak here on Forget-Me-Not. I really am somewhat doubtful this would be a butterfly we'd find in the county, but we did find it over in Greene County in the Catskills. It's a butterfly of high beech forests. And what is interesting about it, aside from the fact that it's just a real rarity, is that its caterpillars appear to feed on developing beech nuts, which is kind of an unusual food source. Most of our caterpillars are feeding on leaves. Okay, moving on to another kind of forest, floodplain forest. We'll have many of those same forest butterflies, but you get some additional ones, like the question mark, whose caterpillars feed on elm, and perhaps some other species as well, but tend to be around floodplain forests. You get the American snout, a elephantine-looking butterfly, whose caterpillars feed on hackberry, which in the county is largely confined to floodplain forests and the neighborhoods of rivers. We have seen it once in the county. Here's the hackberry emperor, another hackberry specialist, again only known from floodplains in the county. This butterfly, the tawny emperor, we have actually never seen in the county. It's another hackberry specialist. This photograph was taken in Ulster County along the Esopus, but there's no reason to think it cannot be here in Columbia County as well. Another type of woodland that I just wanted to bring up is the red cedar woodland. Dylan had mentioned this butterfly. It's the juniper hairstreak, our emerald green butterfly, really associated tightly with red cedar. Wooded wetlands, such as this, could hold a variety of butterflies, but the one I wanted to mention was the wanderer, also known as the harvester. A little, sort of delicately patterned butterfly of areas such as this. And the interesting thing about it, or the question, the mystery, is it really our only carnivorous butterfly? So its caterpillars will feed on woolly aphids that you find on alder. So they are carnivorous. The adults feed on the honeydew that the aphids secrete. Seems to be a little bit of a competition between the generations, but it seems to work. Now, is it the only carnivorous butterfly we have? Well, there is one of those confusing azures whose caterpillars apparently feed on the galls that form on cherry leaves. And they eat not only the plant material of the gall, but they seem to eat the larval material inside the gall. So you can consider them carnivorous. It's also possible that some of our blues, or some of that group that are tended by ants, may occasionally eat ant larvae. So maybe it's our only carnivorous species. It's certainly one of our only carnivorous species. Here's another habitat, dry woods and edges, very sandy soil. Places like this might be where you would see a hoary edge butterfly. I've never seen it, but it might be associated with such habitats. I should say many of those habitats are in the northwest corner of the county. I'll mention that again a little bit later in the talk. Another species that you might see along a road like this would be the common roadside skipper. We have never seen it in the county, but if we were to look for it, this is where we would look for them. Another wooded habitat that bears mentioning are the Heath Barrens. These are up on the tops of the tectonics. Now, in a habitat like this, you might get something like the common wood nymph, although really the common wood nymph is really more of a shrubland species, but I just wanted to throw it in here because it is a butterfly that you see in habitats where you have this kind of shrubby area and open area mixed. A common butterfly, not particularly associated with this habitat. But a butterfly or set of butterflies that you do see up here are the dusky wings. Now, this is a picture of Juvenal's dusky wing, not the only dusky wing reported from the county. There's another relatively common dusky wing, the wild indigo dusky wing, which we have seen occasionally. But there are a few species of dusky wing reported historically which we have not seen, which you might expect to see in a habitat like this. They're very hard to tell. They're very hard to tell apart. And one of the mysteries, this is more a self-reflective mystery, this is whether or not those other dusky wings have actually disappeared or whether they're so hard to identify that, darn it all, we're not actually identifying them, and they are out there. So we're working on these. Places like this, you might get the pine elfin, who's the only butterfly we have whose caterpillars feed on pine. And you could get the brown elfin. This is a butterfly whose caterpillars feed on some of those heaths, some like the blueberries. And it's a butterfly that we only know from habitats like this. A habitat like this might be where you would see the hoary elfin if we were to see it. We have not seen it, but this is where we could look for it. So that's a quick run through of some of the habitats and some of the butterflies in those habitats. And I just wanted to wrap up by sort of saying in a very general sense, where do we look for butterflies? Where should one look for butterflies? And I think the first answer to that is definitely everywhere. So if you want to help us, like with our Columbia County Butterfly Atlas, tell us any butterfly you see. It doesn't matter to us whether it's common or not common. It doesn't matter to us if you've seen it in your backyard or not. Also, getting to know those familiar, more common butterflies is really how you get to be able to pick out the rarer species, because until you know the common ones, you're not going to notice the rare ones. Thinking a little bit about where you find things in the county, this is essentially an elevation map of the county, and it shows the tectonics coming down through the western part, through the eastern part of the county. The Hudson Valley is on the western part. And that eastern hilly region is where you'll find some of those higher, drier pastures that I mentioned, where you find that little blue stem and where you find some of those interesting skippers. It's also where you're going to find some of those Heath Barrens, and where you'll find some of those interesting butterflies. This is a map of soil texture, or specifically it's a map of the percent of sand in the soil. And the darker brown you see on there, the more sand in the soil. So up in that northwest corner, you'll see some large patches of quite dark sandy soil. And this is what I sort of call the Columbia pine bush. I think it was an area where you had lupins, where you had pitch pine, and it would be a place where we would perhaps look for some of those dry woodland species that I mentioned. Who knows if the Carner blue ever occurred? Quite sure it doesn't occur now. But this is soil pH. And this is just worth noting because pH does determine or help determine the flora. In this image, you'll see that the more red-orange areas are more acidic soils. And they actually do not get down to 0.1, but basically less than 4.9 is what is in red. 0.1 would be ridiculously acidic. And then they get up to almost pushing neutral, which is 7. And In the more limey soils, the more neutral soils, you get another set of plant species, and that can affect your not only your plant species, but your butterfly species in terms of who you find. And don't forget about biogeography. Now, it's easy to think that Columbia County is so small that how could biogeography be important for our county? But in fact, it is. For example, up in the northeast corner is the only place we've ever seen an Arctic skipper. And the growing season differs by about 2 weeks between the northeast corner and the southwest corner. So it's really, there are distinct climates, and we often note how much more snow will fall up in the higher northeastern regions than in places closer to the Hudson. So you might look for some of the northerly species up in the northeast corner, whereas if you're looking for some of the southerly species sneaking into the county, you might be best off down in the southwest corner. Although they certainly might come into the Harlem Valley and the northeast, the southeast as well. Now, I'm not going to go into this in any great detail, but just as we think about where to find butterflies, you also need to think about when to find butterflies. Now that all those names down the left there are rarities that we want to be looking for, and you see there the dark shading indicates when these different butterflies fly. So some of them really only fly in May, for example. And if you want to see one of these, you, gosh darn, better go out in May to look for it because you won't get another chance during the year. So this is another way as you're trying to think about where to find some of these rarities and when to find them. This is another piece of information. And you can get really intricate. And this is just some sort of more information that you might use to search for some of these rarities, what the food plants are, etc. But this is a lot of small print. And all I really wanted to say was the most important thing is not to necessarily get obsessed by the small print, but really to have fun. And here's a little Arctic skipper to say goodbye.